There is, within the hidden labyrinths of the psyche, a paradoxical energy, at once luminous and dangerous, that is known to only a few. If you have entered this room tonight, if your soul has wandered to this gathering of seekers, it is likely because you, too, have heard the rumor of this energy, or perhaps you have felt its presence lurking at the edges of your consciousness. Tonight, we are to contemplate one of the most misunderstood archetypes of the modern age, the empath, and what becomes of the empath when their endless ocean of patience finally boils. There is a warning in this reflection, but also a revelation, a path that may illuminate the shadows that cling to your own heart. When we speak of the empath, what are we truly describing? Not merely a person who feels for others, nor simply one who is sensitive to the needs and moods that ripple beneath the surface of every encounter. No, the true empath is a vessel of ancient sensitivity, one whose psychic boundaries are as porous as the border between waking life and the world of dreams. Such a soul is born with a nervous system like an instrument, tuned so finely that even the whispers of suffering or longing from those around them can vibrate through the core of their being. The true empath is not a sentimental caricature, nor a mere victim. The empath is the unconscious priest or priestess of collective pain, bearing wounds that are not only their own, but also those of the world across lifetimes, across ancestral lines. Consider for a moment the dream of a lake at midnight. Its surface is so still that it appears as a sheet of glass, yet beneath the mirror is a teeming world of life. Unseen, unspoken, restless, the empath in the natural state is like this lake, reflective, tranquille, appearing calm to the outside, but inside, currents of feeling, memory, intuition, and anxiety move ceaselessly. The world comes to drink from this lake, to admire its beauty, to cleanse their wounds or wash away their fatigue, but no one truly asks what happens when the lake is drained, or when a storm rages so fiercely that the waters are whipped into chaos. Who is responsible for the care of the empath when all the world seeks comfort at their shore? You see, the tragedy of the empath is not only the suffering they feel, but the role they unconsciously play in the psychic economy of the tribe, the family, the partnership, or the collective. In the old stories, the shaman became the shaman not through choice, but through wounding, through an encounter with death, madness, or isolation that cracked the shell of ordinary reality. The empath, too, becomes what they are through the suffering that pierces them in childhood. Often, before they have words to name their own sorrow, they learn in those formative years that to survive is to absorb, to attune, to anticipate the moods of others, to make themselves indispensable as healers, peacemakers, listeners, or simply as silent witnesses. They become the keeper of secrets, the unacknowledged repository for all that is too heavy for others to bear. The unconscious pact is forged. I will carry what is unbearable, so that you may remain whole. But this is a dangerous pact, for it does not remain at the level of choice. It becomes, over years and decades, a destiny written into the blood and bone, a pattern that repeats from generation to generation until one day the empath either awakens or is destroyed by the very gift that made them beloved and invisible. But what of the shadow of the empath? For every archetype contains its own shadow, its opposite, secret double. The shadow is not evil, but unintegrated. It is the part of the psyche that has been cast away from consciousness because it is too uncomfortable, too chaotic, or too threatening to our self-image. The shadow of the empath is rage, resentment, hidden desire for power, for justice, for reciprocity emotions that are not allowed, that threaten the entire structure of their identity as good, giving, loving, or selfless. Yet these shadows accumulate, like silt at the bottom of the lake, until the water is no longer clear, until the empath's gifts become distorted, their intuition clouded by suppressed fury or exhaustion. There is a dream. I once analyzed a recurring dream reported by many patients over the years, especially those whose lives were spent in endless service to others. The dream is simple. The dreamer finds themselves in a house, familiar but subtly distorted. At first, all is peaceful, but gradually they realize that the rooms are filling with water. The water seeps under the doors, rises up the stairs, soaks the books, blots out the windows. The dreamer tries desperately to save the cherished objects, to warn the family, to stem the flood, but the water rises inexorably. At the climax, the dreamer is either swept away or finds themselves floating in a new world, unrecognizable and empty. This is the dream of the empath. At the breaking point, the rising tide of all that was unspoken, unfelt, geniet. It is the psyche's way of signaling that the threshold has been crossed. When the empath finally snaps, it is never truly sudden. It is the result of years of accumulated neglect, not by the world, though the world plays its part, but by the empath's own refusal to acknowledge their shadow, their limits, their right to boundaries. The most dangerous empath, then, is not the one who is perpetually wounded, forever giving, but the one who at last sees the pattern for what it is, a sacrifice demanded not by love, but by fear. When the empath snaps, a new archetype emerges from the depths. No longer the silent healer, the empath becomes a force of reckoning, a carrier of truth that can no longer be denied. In this eruption, the empath's shadow bursts forth, rage, grief, the cry for justice. The world is often shocked, for the eruption seems out of character. But in truth, it is the most authentic expression of the self that the empath has ever made. Here, let us pause and consider the myth of the volcano. For centuries, villagers live in the shadow of the mountain, cultivating its fertile slopes, drinking from its streams, building their lives upon the certainty of its stillness. The volcano, they say, is sleeping, but those who live closest know that the stillness is not peace, but containment, and that the fire within has its own mysterious rhythm. When the eruption comes, it is both destruction and renewal. The old world is swept away, but the ashes make the soil richer for those who survive. The empath who snaps is like this volcano. The eruption is never without warning if only one knows how to listen. The subtle tremors, the uneasy dreams, the moments of inexplicable sadness or anger, these are all omens of the coming transformation. Yet, until the moment arrives, both the empath and those around them will do all they can to deny, to rationalize, to continue the old pattern. The danger lies not in the eruption itself, but in the refusal to prepare, to listen, to accept that every giving nature contains at its heart a hidden demand for recognition, for dignity, for justice. Let me draw you further into the heart of this archetype, into the realm where the personal merges with the collective, and where the empath's journey becomes the crucible for a new kind of consciousness. The empath is not simply an individual with heightened sensitivity. On the deepest level, the empath is a living symbol of the anima mundi, the world soul. They are the living bridges between the conscious mind and the unconscious, between the isolated ego and the collective psyche. The empath's pain is the pain of the world, and their healing is the promise that the world itself may be healed. Yet, there is a price for this calling, and the price is often paid in silence. The empath absorbs the projections of others, becoming the screen upon which friends, lovers, family, and even strangers project their own disowned emotions, their shame, their helplessness, their rage. Over time, the empath's own sense of self becomes diffuse, scattered, lost among the voices that echo through their inner halls. Who am I, if not the one who listens? Who am I, if not the one who forgives, who carries, who endures? The answer, if it comes at all, is rarely gentle. It arrives in the form of crisis, of snapping, breaking, unraveling. The event may appear minor to the outside observer, a harsh word, a betrayal, a simple failure to be seen. But for the empath, it is as if the axis of the world has shifted. Suddenly, all the old roles collapse. The mask of endless giving shatters. What remains is raw, untamed, wild, a force that has been buried for too long. It is here, in this liminal space, that the opportunity for transformation arises. The snapping of the empath is not only a disaster, it is an initiation. The very energies that once threatened to destroy the empath are now the source of their power, if only they will claim them. The anger, the grief, the longing for justice, these are not signs of failure. but of awakening. They are the voices of the shadow, calling the empath home to themselves, demanding a new order, a new way of being. This is not the work of a day, nor the result of a single insight. It is a process, a descent into the underworld of the soul, a confrontation with the monsters and allies that dwell in the unconscious. The empaths must learn to see themselves not as a victim, nor as a saint, but as a whole being capable of love and anger, of giving and receiving, of joy and sorrow. Only then can the empath return to the world not as a sacrificial lamb, but as a sovereign, a healer who knows the limits of their own energy and who demands the same dignity for themselves that they have always offered to others. We must remember, in every myth, the hero descends into the underworld not to remain there, but to bring back the treasure that lies hidden in the darkness. For the empath, the snapping is not the end, but the beginning of the journey toward integration. The gift of the empath is not their endless capacity for suffering, but their willingness to face the darkness within themselves, to reclaim the lost fragments of their soul, and to become, at last, a whole. If you have followed me thus far, you may begin to sense the outline of a greater truth that waits patiently at the edge of consciousness. As a mountain waits beneath the mist for the dawn, the path of the empath who has reached the breaking point is not merely personal, it is the drama of the archetypal self-seeking wholeness. In the language of the psyche, the eruption of the repressed is always a summons to transformation. The snapping of the empath, with all its terror and liberation, is a mirror for the individuation journey itself. What is it, then, that the empath discovers in that moment of snapping? First, the illusion of separation dissolves. The empath, having spent years or even decades as the vessel for the pain of others, finally meets the disowned aspects of their own nature. The wall between I and thou, between the servant and the world, is breached. For some, this manifests as anger, an eruption of righteous fire long denied. For others, it is sorrow, the tidal wave of grief for a lifetime of unspoken needs, broken promises, the endless deferral of one's own becoming. This is the crucifixion of the old self, the persona crafted with such care to please, to soothe, to remain needed and loved. The empath who snaps is confronted inescapably by the void beneath the role, and in this void, if they do not recoil in terror, if they do not rush to reassemble the mask, something extraordinary can begin. Out of the ashes of the sacrificed self, the possibility of authenticity emerges. In the myths of many cultures, the shattering of the old order is always the harbinger of a deeper wisdom. Consider the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail. This is not a symbol of endless consumption, but of self-renewal. The old identity must die for the new to be born. For the empath, the snapping is the moment when the snake finally turns inward, confronting itself, digesting what has long been left unassimilated. Yet this process is rarely clean or dignified. It is more like a storm at sea, a wild and churning tempest in which all familiar landmarks disappear. The empath may find themselves weeping without knowing why, or filled with a rage that threatens to consume every relationship they have cultivated. There may be dreams of fire, of flood, of battles fought in strange lands. These are the psyche's images for the inner struggle, the conscious mind trying to make sense of the unconscious revolt. To those around the empath, this may seem like madness, but it is, in fact, the madness that precedes the birth of a new order. From a psychological perspective, the danger is not the eruption itself, but what follows if the empath is shamed, pathologized, or coerced back into their old role by themselves or by others. The cycle will repeat with even greater violence. The lesson will become more severe, the suffering more acute. The way forward is not to repress the eruption, but to listen to it, to dialogue with the shadow, to welcome the monstrous visitor as a messenger from the depths. There is a recurring motif in the dreams of those who have finally reached the edge. The motif of the house in ruins or the city overtaken by wilderness. This is the psyche's way of signaling that the old structures are no longer viable. What once provided safety and belonging has become a prison. The snapping of the empath is the psychic earthquake that levels the city, uproots the foundations, and demands a rebuilding on truer ground. But what, you may ask, is to be built in the aftermath? Here we touch the central mystery of individuation. The empath, released from bondage, stands at a crossroads. One path leads backward to the comfort of old suffering. The familiar patterns of self-erasure and people-pleasing. The other path winds forward into the unknown terrain of selfhood, dignity, and integrated power. This is not the power of dominance or control, but the subtle, radiant power of the self, the authority that comes from being aligned with the truth of one's own soul. To walk this path, the empath must reclaim their projections. For so long, they have seen themselves as healers, helpers, martyrs, roles that, while noble, are incomplete. The snapping is the call to see oneself as both healer and wounded, both light bearer and shadow wrestler. It is the recognition that to be whole is not to be free of pain, but to be free of falsehood. The empath must gather back the fragments of themselves that were scattered in service to others, to welcome back the orphaned emotions, the forbidden desires, the anger that was always a plea for respect. This is not a journey to be undertaken in isolation, though solitude is often its doorway. Just as the ancient initiates sought the wisdom of the oracle or the guidance of the wise elder, so too does the snapping empath require witnesses, souls who can hold space for the chaos, who do not flinch at the spectacle of the sacred fire. These may be therapists, friends, lovers, or even the silent presence of nature itself. What matters is not that the empath is fixed, but that they are seen, known, and accepted in the full spectrum of their humanity. In this way, the snapping becomes an initiation, a rite of passage into deeper life. It is an opportunity for the empath to move from the unconscious role of sacrifice to the conscious choice of authentic living. The wisdom that emerges is hard-won, paid for in tears and nights of despair, but it is unshakable. The empath who has survived their own eruption becomes a force in the world, a presence that cannot be manipulated, shamed, or used as a vessel for other people's pain. Here, the mystical dimension of the empath's journey comes into focus. The snapping is not only a personal crisis, but a participation in the eternal pattern of death and rebirth. As the old self dies, so does the collective illusion that sensitivity is weakness, that love must always mean self-abandonment. The empath, standing in the ruins of their former life, can become a living testament to the resilience of the soul, a reminder that boundaries are not barriers to love, but the very conditions that make love possible. Let us pause for a moment and consider a recurring image from the world of dreams, the mirror. The mirror is, in Jungian symbolism, the interface between consciousness and unconsciousness. It reflects not only the face we show the world, but the depths that lie behind our eyes. For the empath, the snapping is often experienced as a moment of finally seeing themselves not as they wish to be, but as they truly are, shadows and all. It is a revelation that is at once terrifying and liberating. The empath beholds the wounds they have carried, the anger they have denied, the power they have hidden, and recognizes, perhaps for the first time, that they are not only survivors, but creators. In the months and years that follow the snapping, the empath's life is forever changed. Relationships may fall away, careers may shift, old certainty dissolve. This is the cost of truth. The world is not always kind to those who refuse to play the roles assigned to them. But the world also has a secret respect for those who have walked through fire and returned with their integrity intact. The dangerous empath, the one who has snapped and survived, is no longer a passive participant in their own story. They have become a conscious co-creator, shaping reality from the inside out. From the vantage point of the self, the snapping was never a punishment, but a calling. The violence of the eruption was the medicine. The soul required a radical rebalancing of the inner and outer worlds. The empath, now aware of their own depths, can offer true compassion not as self-sacrifice, but as shared humanity. Their boundaries are no longer walls, but thresholds, places where the sacred and the ordinary meet, where healing is possible, but not at the cost of the self. I invite you then to contemplate the deeper layers of your own story. Where have you played the role of the empath? Where have you been asked by others or by your own inner patterns to give more than you possess? Have you felt the tremors of your own snapping, the restless energy beneath the surface that longs for liberation? Do not turn away from this energy. It is the herald of your becoming, the guardian of your truth. The task as always, is not to eradicate the darkness, but to befriend it. The snapping is the soul's demand for wholeness. To walk this path is to honor both your pain and your power, to become the author of your own myth rather than a character in someone else's dream. The world does not need more saints who vanish in the service of others. The world needs whole human beings, empaths who have made peace with their shadow and who can love fiercely, without surrendering themselves to the hunger of the collective. As you reflect upon these words, do not be afraid of your anger, your grief, your longing for justice. These are not signs of your failure as an empath, but of your awakening as a soul. Trust the process of dissolution, the sacred unraveling that precedes every true transformation. Remember, the volcano is dangerous not because it erupts, but because we refuse to heed its warnings. Listen to the rumblings within. Honor the voice that says, enough. Stand in the fire of your own truth and discover in the ashes the beginnings of your real life. If you allow yourself to listen deeply to the words, but also to the resonance of your own inner world, you may sense the psychic alchemy at work. When the empath snaps, a veil is torn between worlds. It is a moment when the individual soul, so long dissolved in the needs and emotions of the collective, calls back its essence. This act, though outwardly marked by anger or sorrow, is in truth an act of profound remembrance. The psyche, like an ancient city buried beneath centuries of sediment, stirs and sends up signs of life, fragments of forgotten selfhood, old dreams, the glint of gold in the mud. I have witnessed, both in the consulting room and within my own inner landscapes, how such moments are seldom understood by those who have never felt the agony of overextension. Family, friends, even the empaths themselves may mistake the snapping as evidence of weakness or instability. But in the language of the unconscious, this rupture is the first labor pain of rebirth. The shadow surges upward, not to destroy, but to reintegrate what has been lost or denied. The empath, if they can endure the disorientation, stands at the threshold of a more authentic existence. Let us wander for a moment in the realm of symbols, for here the unconscious speaks most clearly. Imagine, if you will, a forest at twilight, a landscape familiar yet unknown, where paths vanish and the trees seem to lean in with listening intent. The snapping empath enters this forest not as a conqueror, but as one called home. Each step is a descent into the underworld of the soul, a journey into the roots where pain and power intertwine. In dreams, this descent is often portrayed as a fall, a plunge into darkness, or a walk along a narrowing path, the way forward. Obscured by mist, it is here, among the tangled roots and hidden creatures, that the empath must confront the archetypes that have haunted them since childhood. The wounded healer, who learned to mend others' wounds while neglecting their own. The self-sacrificer, who measured worth in the currency of exhaustion. The child who listens, who was told, often without words, that their value depended upon being invisible, agreeable, absorbent as rain. These archetypes do not merely haunt the personal psyche. They are collective images, ancient patterns shaped by countless generations. They are, as I have written, living parts of the unconscious, autonomous, creative, and, if denal, destructive. The empath snapping brings these figures into view, often for the first time. What follows is not a battle in the ordinary sense, but a negotiation, a recognition, the empath standing amid the ruins of old defenses may ask, what do you want from me? What wisdom hides within your pain? If they can bear to listen, answers will emerge, not in the voice of judgment, but of necessity. The wounded healer demands compassion for the self. The self-sacrificer reveals the craving for respect and reciprocal love. The child who listens pleads for the safety to speak their own truth. This dialogue with the archetypes is the heart of shadow work. It is not a matter of willpower or self-improvement, but of surrender to a deeper intelligence within the psyche, left to its own devices, seeks balance. The snapping is its way of righting the scales, of reclaiming power that was given away, sometimes long before memory. It is a kind of psychic homecoming, and yet the forest is not without its dangers. There is a seduction in the shadow, a temptation to swing from self-denial to self-absorption, from martyrdom to vengeance. The empath, flooded with the power of reclaimed anger, may for a time become rigid, even cruel, defending new boundaries with a ferocity born of centuries of neglect. This is a necessary stage, yet not the end of the journey. The task is not to become the shadow, but to integrate it, to find the middle path, where compassion and strength coexist. It is here that the motif of the mirror returns, now seen in a new light. The empath, who once reflected the world's pain without filter, must learn to see themselves not only as mirror, but as flame. The world may recoil at this new heat. Old relationships may falter, but this fire, if tended, becomes a hearth, a place of warmth, protection, and creative energy. The empath sensitivity is no longer a trap, but a channel for something greater than personal suffering. The wisdom that arises from having survived, from having lost and found oneself again in the ashes. Let us speak also of dreams, for they are the royal road to the unconscious. In the aftermath of snapping, many report dreams of flight soaring over mountains, leaping impossible chasms, gliding on currents of wind. These are not fantasies of escape, but symbols of expansion. A psyche, once cramped by the burden of everyone else's pain, now stretches its wings. There are also dreams of confrontation, standing up to a tyrant, rescuing a lost child, entering a locked room and discovering a forgotten treasure. Each of these is an image of soul retrieval, the gradual return of what was sacrificed on the altar of belonging. At this stage, the empath's greatest danger is not outside criticism, but inner doubt. The legacy of self-abandonment is insidious. Even as new boundaries are drawn, old habits whisper, "Who do you think you are? To take up space, to speak your anger, to refuse the suffering of others?" The empath, now aware of these voices, must answer with the authority of one who has walked through fire. I am. This is not narcissism, but the birthright of the authentic self. Only by affirming one's own existence can the empath become a force for real healing in the world. Here, the mystical aspect becomes clear. The snapping is not a single event, but a series of awakenings. The empath dies and is reborn many times, each time shedding an outworn skin, each time discovering a deeper layer of truth. The journey is spiral, not linear, moving ever closer to the center where self and world, shadow and light are reconciled. The empath's new life is marked not by the absence of pain, but by the presence of meaning. We must not forget that every personal myth is woven into the collective. When an empath snaps and survives, their transformation echoes outward. Families, communities, even societies organized around exploitation and emotional labor may begin to tremble at their foundations. The world resists such change, for it depends upon the silent labor of those who feel too much and ask too little. But there is no progress without disruption. The healed empath, once weaponized against themselves, now stands as living proof that the soul cannot be conquered by the demands of the collective. It is not uncommon for those who have come through the snapping to find themselves called to new forms of service, not as martyrs, but as guides, healers, artists, or truth tellers. Their wounds become their credentials, their suffering, the source of wisdom. No longer driven by compulsion, they choose where to invest their energy, and their compassion is no longer a bottomless well, but a river with banks flowing powerfully and purposefully through the world. Allow yourself to imagine for a moment the possibility that your suffering was never in vain, the ache of overfeeling, the agony of invisibility, the rage of unrequited love. These are the fires in which your soul was forged. There is gold in the shadow, as I have so often written. The snapping is the moment when you realize that you, and only you, can mine that gold. The tools are self-awareness, honest reflection, and the willingness to grieve what was lost along the way. But beyond the grief lies freedom, the freedom to live as you are rather than as you were taught to be. If you carry nothing else from this discourse, let it be the memory that the journey through the shadow is sacred. There is no shame in having reached your limit. The psyche knows what it must do to survive. Your snapping, your breakdown, your eruption. These are not failures, but the soul's demand for restoration. If you heed the call, if you are gentle with yourself in the aftermath, you will discover that what was broken is not gone, but transformed The wound becomes the womb of creation, the lost voice becomes the song, the rage becomes the fire that lights your path home. As we draw closer to the end of this exploration, I invite you to recognize that the journey of the empath who snaps is, in truth, the drama of all human souls seeking wholeness. Each of us carries within the delicate balance between the call to care for others and the deep, silent longing to be seen, cherished, and allowed to exist in our own right. The snapping of the empath is not a singular catastrophe, but the universal moment in which the soul declares, I am no longer willing to abandon myself for the comfort of others. It is the secret revolution of individuation, the act by which we step out of inherited roles and into the luminous territory of the self. There is great grief in this awakening, for what is lost is not merely an identity, but a mythology, the cherished fantasy that by suffering enough, we might finally be loved as we desire. The empath who snaps must mourn not only their exhaustion and betrayal, but also the loss of innocence, the realization that their giving was, at times, compulsion disguised as virtue, a hunger for recognition, dressed as selflessness. This is a necessary sorrow, and it opens the heart in ways the intellect can never achieve. If you find yourself weeping at the memory of all you gave away, let your tears be a sacred rain upon a thirsty earth, for in that moment you touch the archetype of the divine child, the one who is always beloved, always worthy, simply by being after the storm. A stillness descend. The psychic landscape is altered. Old structures may lie in ruin, relationships reshaped or gone, the world no longer arranged to your constant accommodation. This can feel unbearably lonely at first. Yet if you do not rush to rebuild the prison of your old patterns, something extraordinary happens. The space left by the snapping is not emptiness, but potential. It is here, in the silent aftermath, that the authentic self emerges. You may find yourself drawn to solitude, to nature, to art, to new companions who are not threatened by your boundaries, but honor them as the sacred line between two souls. The world, too, responds in ways both painful and miraculous. Those who needed you weak or compliant may drift away, unable to recognize the new you. Others, awakened by your courage, may step forward with their own stories of snapping and renewal. The air between people, once heavy with unspoken bargains and silent resentment, clears. You find yourself breathing more deeply. The nervous system, so long attuned to danger and the moods of others, relaxes into a rhythm. You barely remember. For the first time, you can ask yourself, what do I want? What do I need? What brings me joy? Apart from my usefulness to others? These are not selfish questions. They are the soul's way of rerouting itself in the reality of incarnation. Now, the journey becomes one of integration. The empath's sensitivity, once a source of pain and confusion, becomes a finely tuned instrument for discerning truth, beauty, and meaning not only in others, but in oneself. The anger that once threatened to consume now burns as creative fire. Grief is no longer a swamp, but a river that moves you toward deeper intimacy with life. Compassion ceases to be a debt to be paid and becomes instead a natural overflow of a heart no longer in hiding. You can say yes and mean it. You can say no and not fear exile. This is the gift of the snapping, to recover your soul, not as a martyr or rescuer, but as a participant in the dance of becoming. But do not imagine that this is the end. The psyche is vast, and its waves continue to rise and fall. There will be days when the old patterns beckon, when guilt or loneliness call you back to familiar chains. In those moments, return to the wisdom learned in the fire. Your boundaries are not a wall against love, but the very form that makes real love possible every time you honor the voice within. Every time you choose authenticity over approval, you strengthen the bridge between your conscious self and the great unconscious sea from which you came. Let me offer you, as we conclude, an invitation, a gentle encouragement, not as a prescription, but as a path of wonder. In the days ahead, treat your inner life as a living landscape. Enter it as you would a forest at dawn, with curiosity, reverence, and patience. Notice the places within that feel trampled or neglected, and sit quietly with them, asking not what you can do to fix them, but what stories they wish to tell. When anger arises, greet it as an old companion who has returned with news from the borderlands of the soul. When sorrow visits, allow it to move through you like rain through earth, cleansing, nourishing, softening the ground for new growth. Pay attention to your dreams, for they are the secret letters your unconscious sends you each night. Write them down, follow their symbols. Let them guide you to forgotten parts of yourself. If you encounter a child in your dream, listen to what they say. If you find yourself in a ruined house, search for the hidden room. If you meet a figure of fire or water, let them show you what power lives within. These are not mere fantasies, but the living images of your psyche calling you home. Above all, practice honesty with yourself first, and then with others. Speak your needs, even if your voice trembles. Express your no as a blessing, not a curse. Seek out those who celebrate your wholeness, not your sacrifice. Spend time in the company of trees, rivers, stars, witnesses who ask nothing but your presence. Allow yourself to play, to create, to rest. The world is not saved by those who burn themselves up in its service, but by those who bring their whole, radiant, undivided being to the table of life. If you are willing, make of your life a living experiment. Try each day to listen more deeply to your own soul than to the demands of those who fear your power. Notice where you are tempted to shrink, to apologize, to become invisible. And in those moments, take a breath and remain. There is a quiet revolution in such acts, a gradual turning of the tide over time. you will find that the snapping was not an end, but the opening of a gate, a passage into the luminous, untamed freedom that has always been your birthright. In closing, let me remind you, the most dangerous empath is not the one who erupts in fury, nor the one who retreats into silence, but the one who has made peace with the full spectrum of their humanity. Such a person is a light the world cannot control, a presence that reveals what is possible when the soul refuses to betray itself. If you are willing to walk this path, you will become not only a healer, but a maker of worlds, a bearer of the sacred fire that transforms suffering into wisdom and isolation into belonging. May you go forth from this night with a deeper trust in your own journey, a clearer sense of your worth, and the courage to meet whatever arises with open eyes and an open heart. The world awaits the song only you can sing, the story only you can live. Listen, remember, begin again.